Oh, I like that jazzy music Stu has with his Energy Newsbeat podcast. Hello, everybody. This is David Blackmon. Welcome to Energy Impacts. I'm David Blackmon. Obviously, Stu Turley is with me, co-host with his Energy Newsbeat podcast. With us today, very special guest who we've interviewed several times in the past and who is just a voice of knowledge and reason in a world that's gone completely stark, raving, damn mad. Doomberg, how you doing today?
Stu, David, thanks for having me back on. David, thanks for that introduction. It's always great to chat with you guys. And by the way, it's not like there's a paucity of things for us to discuss.
Yeah, there's a few things going on. It's not a slow news day. It never is with Donald Trump in the White House. He makes sure of that every morning and every evening, 2 o'clock in the morning, whenever he's on his iPhone tweeting or whatever you call it these days. And as Brett Baker says, Doomberg is our favorite green chicken. Absolutely. Absolutely. So we're going to try to cover a lot of things with you. I know you've been doing some fantastic writing, as always, at your Substack. Tell people where they can find you first before we go any further on Substack.
Yeah, Doomberg.com is the landing page for everything we do. We have our monthly articles. We try to publish between 7 and 9 times a month. We have all of our podcast appearances like this there under our Doomcast page. And then we have a pro tier where we, in addition to our articles, we do a monthly webinar, pretty popular amongst the subset of people who want a bit more Doomberg, usually 45 minutes to an hour. We got a really exciting one teed up this month. I'll give you the exclusive. We're going to take a look at the abiotic theory of oil, Tom Gold stuff. And we're going to do a balanced assessment of the forbidden hypothesis as the current working subtitle of the presentation. So we've
God, I'm going to have to tune into that one.
Well, it'll cost you. Maybe I'll comp you, David.
Okay. All right. Well, I've got a little budget for that. Not a big budget for that though. Anyway, so thank you very much. One of the pieces, and Stu was talking about this before we got on, is this piece you wrote last week. I believe it was last week about Governor Moonwalker, Gavin Newsom in California. Tell us about your views on what Gavin Newsom's been doing with refiners and the oil and energy industry in general out in California lately.
Sure. I think we should start by talking about the man himself and the politician, because actually I think many of his critics substantially underestimate him.
Yeah.
He is a very effective retail politician. He looks the part. He's handsome. He's got great hair. He's charismatic. He's a good debater. It's not an accident that he is distilled up to the top of the big blue machine in California. Even single party states are tough to navigate through. It takes a mix of political instincts, raw power, and frankly, probably a healthy dose of psychopathy to get to the top in such environments. But he has, and he shouldn't be underestimated. And he has ambitions. He's term limited now, so he can't run again in California. And he clearly is eyeing a promotion to the top job in 2028. And he will be a formidable candidate when people who are sort of Trump supporters or are opposed to Newsom's policies think we're being, a little sort of optimistic about his potential impact at the national stage. We remind people that Trump only beat Vice President Harris by 1.5% in the popular vote, and he's at least 2 points better than she was as a candidate. So we shall see. And by the way, Trump is almost certainly not running again. And so, there's a subset of the population that voted for him, the man, that might not show up again to vote for whoever replaces him. So his chances of getting to the White House are real and should not be minimized. To your question about the refineries, well, we've written several pieces on this developing crisis because eventually it will turn into a crisis. We're one major refinery explosion away from an energy crisis in either northern or southern Californias, because the first thing that we should say is you have to view the gasoline market in California as two isolated islands. Northern California and Southern California, they both burn the same fuel made to the same spec in the same grades, but there's really no pipelines connecting the two. And there's only really outbound pipelines to support Arizona, Nevada with the same grades of gasoline. That whole part of the country west of the Colorado, is disconnected from the energy grid of the rest of the United States. And so that's one sort of axiom of analysis. The second axiom of analysis is that California is an incredibly difficult place to do business in if you're a fossil fuel company or a hydrocarbon company, depending on how our Doom Zoom presentation goes on abiotic oil. And state regulators don't want refiners to make money. They browbeat them all the time, all manner of regulations and lawsuits and so on. And then frankly, the people who operate in California don't make money there. And then the last point of analysis is the companies that are operating the final refineries, and there's the list of them there on the screen. To them, California is a nuisance relative to their global operations. They don't actually want to be operating in California.
Right.
Many of them are still in business simply because they don't want to take the cleanup legacy costs as a charge when they inevitably pull out of the state. And so what you see is Gavin Newsom, in their infinite wisdom, the California State Assembly passed a new law that mandates that refiners substantially increase the volume they keep on hand in inventory in order to avoid these price spikes that were happening. And that was kind of the last straw. And so since that bill was signed, Phillips 66 announced the closure of a large refinery just outside of Los Angeles, and Valero is closing its refinery outside of San Francisco. So Northern California will have precisely 2 large refineries left, and Southern California will have 4. And if one of those refineries has an explosion, by the way, handling flammable hydrocarbons often leads to such unintended accidents. They happen all the time in the industry. California today only has something like 11 or 2 weeks worth of gasoline in inventory.
Right.
You have a run on the pumps. It's coming. Like we've written about this for a year. It's going to happen. And when it happens, they'll, just like the fires in Los Angeles, there'll be all manner of blame storming. And but by the way, go back to that chart, because there's one more thing I want to say. The biggest refinery in Northern California, that Richmond Chevron facility, sits right on top of the Hayward Fault.
Yeah.
And it's it's like decades overdue. It has a major earthquake every, I forget what the number, maybe 100 and some odd years, and they're like 20 years or 15 years overdue for a major earthquake. And
so do you think President Trump should rename that fault the Biden fault?
I mean, it honestly, like, we write these things as warnings. Like, and by the way, like, there's no sophisticated analysis to come up with this chart. You could just go and Google it.
Yeah, it's all publicly available.
It's all publicly available. And you could just do the math. Like, nobody wants to make that special California grade. It's a nuisance. And so, and by the way, since there's no pipelines, they have to rely on imports. Well, imports don't just arrive, they have to sail. And you'll quickly run out of gasoline. Like, you can pretend like fossil fuels don't matter and that you don't need them, but they do. Yeah, go ahead.
Mr. Doomberg, do you think that before Gavin Newsom got into power, California was energy independent basically by the refineries? I talked to Mike Umbro out of California, Cool Cat, and also interviewed Ronald Stein about this issue. And Mike Umbro brought up a great point. The refineries in California are set up for Alaskan oil. Why in the world are we allowing and as Ronald Stein has said, this is too smart for me. I'm not that smart, but he said California is now a national security risk with all the airplanes. It's the largest airplane fuel use in the area, and the refineries could use Alaskan oil that we wouldn't even have to import. They import 75% or more of their oil from countries that hate us.
Look, California could be Texas. It has enormous oil deposits. It has a giant shale that nobody ever talks about because everyone just assumes it's off limits for exploration and development. The potential of that shale is regularly de-emphasized by the progressive environmental left because they don't want that shale to be developed. The difference between California's energy production and Texas's energy production is not a function of geology.
Yeah,
it is a
public
function
policy.
of politics and policy.
Yeah.
And so you have the integrated impact of insane policies year after year after year. And eventually something breaks because physics is physics and physics doesn't care about your platitudes. So if you make it impossible to do business in your state, people will no longer do business in your state. That's why all the rich people moved to Austin. This is why Chevron finally left the state. There's only so much you can do before something breaks. And we are predicting that the thing that will break, by the way, really happy that you figured out how to use the PDF generator for Doomberg. Substack made that feature just for us, you should know.
Oh, awesome.
So like that which can't go on forever usually doesn't. It, by the way, like oil was largely a California thing in the beginning in the US. Over time, things have shifted, politics has shifted. So Alaska, of course, which is the subject of a future Doom Zoom, probably next month.
Nice.
The Great Alaska Pipeline, well, production is being constrained there because of the relationship between Washington and Alaska. And that pipeline, by the way, is barely flowing enough oil to keep it going. This is a sort of a underreported national security risk. The reserves that have been set aside remind me of much of the U.S. Gulf Coast and what is now the Gulf of America. So much more oil could be flowing out of the Gulf of America than currently is. And these are all, again, political choices, which, again, when people talk about peak oil, I have to roll my eyes because there's so much oil to be had that it literally is just a matter of political choices. And when oil goes to 300, because we're short of it, those politics will be wiped away. So even California might produce from its shale resource in such an environment. So I think Gavin Newsom's hope, and the point of this piece, Moonwalker, is he's suddenly instructing his appointees to play nice with the refiners and try to find win-win solutions where, California has access to the gasoline it needs and refiners can earn a respectable profit. It's just a total 180-degree about face. Last thing I'll say is it's why I personally and no member of the Doomberg team, and I suspect neither of you, could ever run for public office because we're just incapable. We're just incapable of doing a complete about face and acting as though we hadn't been saying the opposite for 10 years.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that all fits right in with his podcast, right? I mean, he's mounting this podcast now. He's interviewing conservative guests, or at least he started out doing it. So he can train himself to say things he doesn't actually believe, or maybe he doesn't actually believe the way he's governed all the time. But it's just basically an exercise in trying to train himself and prepare himself for the 2028 election by learning how to adopt a different set of talking points from the other side.
Yeah.
And so the man doesn't believe anything. He's this empty vessel for others to fill with their own ideas. And so that makes him just like who? Just exactly like Barack Obama. And he's probably a better retail politician than Obama was. So people really do underestimate him.
We wrote about that podcast in March in a piece called The Magician's Trick, talking about how California blames wildfires on big oil, but the real culpability, of course, lies in Sacramento. And the opening story for that piece was the actually quite entertaining podcast that he had with Steve Bannon.
That was fantastic.
It's great. And, by the way, you found yourself giving Newsom credit for at least talking to Steve Bannon and having the banter. And of course, Steve Bannon is a very effective debater, so it was interesting to watch. But as I was watching it, I was like, I'm falling for the trick.
Yeah, exactly.
But if it's working even temporarily on me, it's going to work on 3% of the people, which is a swing from a Trump landslide to a Newsom presidency.
The one thing that all three of us have been is that all three of us on this podcast with Chris Wright. And I'll tell you, I just want to say it's a breath of fresh air that we have Doug Burgum Secretary of the Energy, Lee Zeldin with the EPA and the regulations coming around. We have Chris Wright, who I think is one of the classiest guys on the planet. Let me show you this last comment that we had here.
Of myself, because there's energy sources that swallow money and don't deliver value. So I'm not for them, but I am for all energy sources that are affordable, reliable, secure, and better system.
Isn't that great? Have the energy Secretary of Energy that actually understands energy.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great for everybody except for the producers of energy, because as we've long warned, and I think that's the part that I kind of find amazing, maybe a bit of a sidetrack here. Trump ran on American energy dominance.
Yeah,
I bet 95% of the oil and gas industry executives voted for him. And when you have American energy dominance, it means that the world, he really means he wants oil prices low so he can catalyze a manufacturing reindustrialization across the US.
Correct.
And more oil means lower priced oil, which means producers suffer. And how can you say you want American energy dominance if production in the US is going to be curtailed? Well, he doesn't really want American energy dominance. He wants cheap oil. And one of the ways to do that is to jawbone and to cut deals with OPEC, which I'm sure we'll get into. But it was never going to be a surprise. Like I saw Javier Blas, who's a great commodities reporter for Bloomberg, reporting out from the big energy conference that Chris Wright spoke at, and talking about the rumblings amongst the energy industry executives that we thought Chris Wright was our guy and he's really a Trump guy. He's like, no, he's an energy guy, an energy abundance guy. By the way, his old company, Liberty, was a services provider and did well, scaled on volume, not price. And so, I mean, everybody benefits when price is high, but midstreamers and service providers do well regardless of price. And so, I mean, in his manifesto that he published, before Trump selected him, made very clear he's an all of the above, produce energy abundance, energy is life, all of the things that we've talked about before. Yep, that's right. Bettering human lives. He is a human first person. To better human lives by producing abundant energy, somebody's going to take the hit, and the equity stack of producers in the U.S. is probably going to suffer.
But let me throw this at us, because as my real day job is looking at oil and gas investments and deals. And that's how I make my job. I just do podcast hosting so I can get my fix for being a podcast host. But when we take a look at the difference between OPEC and the rest of the world, the United States has capitalism at its beck and call, and Saudi Arabia and OPEC. Saudi Arabia is trying to control OPEC, and plus you have Russia with a 4.2% GDP growth, I believe, in the last year. And they've avoided sanctions with the dark fleet. And then we have Kazakhstan and Iran all going over their quotas, I believe, very heavily. And that's why we wanted to get in here and talk about OPEC and what Saudi Arabia is trying to do. But the United States can recover because of our capitalism and being able to spend back up when the money is right. That's different than the state-owned. Fair assessment?
Yeah, I have a different view of what's going on with OPEC that we've written about several times now. A deal was struck between Trump and the Saudis, perhaps even with Russia. We don't know what was exchanged. Look, for weeks you had Russia, the United States, and Saudi Arabia engaged in high-stakes diplomacy. The cover story was the war in Ukraine. History teaches us when you have significant turning points, the contemporary reporting of what's actually going on is wrong.
It's completely wrong.
And a deal was struck. Trump wants $50 oil. He looks likely to get it. I think this is the end of OPEC, really. I know we've been out there on that call, like how OPEC ends was a piece we wrote last year. We think, look, the market for crude oil has changed substantially. And in order to understand what's going on in crude oil, you can't just look at crude oil anymore. In the US, there are now 3 types of hydrocarbon producers. Those that produce just crude oil, those that produce just natural gas, and those that co-produce both and NGLs in the mix of lights that come out of, say, the Permian. 50% of US crude production and 75% of US natural gas production is now subject to co-product economics. And anybody who has ever operated in industry, and I have, where you have a co-product economic situation, you get wildly different impacts than you might imagine. So imagine a world where tomorrow, natural gas in the Permian was $8 a million BTU. Oil would suddenly become the product people would give away in a rush to drill for natural gas, right? And people
And
can't
we've been
even,
there before, yes.
right? And people can't even begin to contemplate that. So today, because OPEC has kept crude oil prices artificially high, because that's what a cartel does. Oil is a managed market. People need to know that. So OPEC keeps crude oil prices artificially high. Drillers in the Permian are giving away natural gas to get the crude. Natural gas trading at $1 a million BTU or $6 a barrel oil gets soaked up. Engines get switched, and prices eventually have to converge. And the existence of OPEC guarantees its eventual demise. To its credit, it has been the most effective cartel in modern economic history.
It really has.
But its time is over, and it will have been undone by the wave of light hydrocarbons coming that are selling at a huge discount, that are precipitating engine switching across all supply chains, starting in the US. We're seeing it in China. We did a whole doom zoom on natural gas liquids and Mont Belvieu, and the fact that there's hundreds of millions of barrels. Like the Mont Belvieu NGL storage infrastructure is within spitting distance of how much oil we have in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. It's a massive facility. It's all brand new, and engines are switching. Ethane-only crackers are replacing naphtha crackers, and LNG-powered trucks are replacing diesel trucks in China, and LNG-powered cargo ships are replacing bunker oil. The world is going lighter, and in a world where OPEC basically only produces crude oil, their time is up. So a deal was cut.
Wow.
Trump wants $50 oil. I don't know what was given in exchange. A hunch, gold price is allowed to run. Saudi Arabia owns a lot of gold. Who knows? Something was done. When OPEC poured oil on a burning tape that Thursday after Liberation Day, we sat up in our chair and said, whoa, this is different. This is historic. Something has shifted. And as we just wrote in a sort of a follow-up piece the week that was, where we covered three stories, OPEC, the Canadian election, and the blackout in Spain. Trump wants $50 oil. WTI settled between 60 and 65. So Saudi came out again and stomped on the tape. We're going to 50. I don't know who's buying oil at 62, but they don't like money.
Yeah, it does feel like we're going to be at 50 pretty quick too.
I mean, it might be the bottom, by the way. Like, we're close to finding a new equilibrium.
Yeah.
And then what you'll see, which is what we've seen historically, is the big companies will buy the small companies at distressed prices. They'll wait for a Democratic administration and they'll print cash. So our general view of the world is that infrastructure gets built during Republican administrations and money gets made during Democratic administrations. And it's funny to watch, amusing to watch, conservative-oriented executives in a conservative industry vote for Trump and wonder why oil prices are going down. The man ran on a platform of cheap oil. And he, if nothing else,
he didn't lie to anybody about it either.
Lie to anybody about it.
Yeah.
But Chris, right?
Let me ask this.
Go ahead.
I don't disagree with anything that you're saying, but when we take a look at normal decline curves around the world, and I do not believe that one basin does not make a you can't determine that the Permian, yes, it's going to be more oil going on because we have water problems going on in the Permian. One basin output doesn't say that we're at peak oil. We haven't even begun to hit peak oil, in my opinion. But as we sit here and we take a look, I forgot my damn question.
Well,
I was on a roll here. I pulled a David Blackmon. Holy smokes.
I think you were fixing to say something about the fact that the Permian Basin may have peaked, at least temporarily.
Yes, but
and
when we sit down,
but this is the capital cycle. So you were basically saying, hey, won't we have curtailment and then we'll have a shortage and price will spike? Yes, all of those things are true. What's important to do is to not draw a tangent line to a sine wave. The demand and production for oil goes up and to the right with a sine wave function for two reasons. One, the demand for energy is infinite, but two, the capital deployment cycle and the business cycle can sometimes get out of phase. And so you alternate between gluts and shortages and gluts and shortages and gluts and shortages. And with each glut, the industry gets better and better at finding oil and bringing it to the market. And you know, the break-even price of natural gas in Appalachia is what, $2.50 a million BTU now.
Right.
I think at a strip price of $4 a million BTU, everybody's earning their cost of capital.
Oh yeah.
Which means $10 landed LNG, everybody is earning their cost of capital. And since that's $58 Brent, that's probably the equilibrium price for international oil, because the two are switchable. That's how we view the world.
Wow.
So I think low 50s WTI is probably a bottom. I'm not sure if it'll be a tradable bottom, but and I think the big wild card in a piece, I think it was called "As the Pieces Lie." Like, I just think, here's the thing: in this business, there's a whole architecture of content creators, Twitter accounts, industry executives who want the price of oil to go up, and I get that, right? Everybody makes money when numbers go up. But I think as an analyst and not an advocate, you have to play the pieces as they lie. And a classic example, an account I won't name, has a large following, never saw a headline that they couldn't spin bullish, and posted on Twitter that NGLs don't count.
I think I may know who this is, but anyway, go ahead.
And like, you know, that meme where you're pointing at the mirror, it's like, it's not that you don't understand energy, it's that NGLs don't count. I mean, what are you talking about? NGLs don't count. Tell that to the NAFTA cracker that just shut down in the Netherlands because a giant ethane-only cracker opened up in Pennsylvania. I mean,
Yeah.
of course they count. What happens to that NAFTA? It gets recirculated back into the quote-unquote oil infrastructure, and it gets used to, you know, commingled with heavy crude in Alberta or Venezuela or whatever. Pick your favorite.
Right.
Like, in the end, all hydrocarbons get burned to create heat to do work. Period. And we will switch the engines. And the very price differentials that exist in the US, $3 a million BTU natural gas, you know,
Right.
pick your favorite price for NGLs. People will not have the cleanest burning, cheapest sources of hydrocarbons selling at a discount forever.
Right.
NGLs don't count. Imagine.
Yeah, it's probably best we don't name who that is. I may be wrong, but
Yeah,
But
exactly.
The one thing, you know, the International Monetary Fund on OPEC said that the Saudis, this is bringing up a huge question, and that is you look at the end of, I think NATO has outserved its thing. The EU has outserved its trading bloc. Trading blocks are changing around the world, but also the taking a look at not only the OPEC needing, the International Monetary Fund says OPEC needs a ballpark of $95 oil just to meet their normal sovereign fund, wealth fund, and social building projects and everything else. I've always crayoned off on the side that we'd be around the $80 oil worldwide, based off of the $4 trillion that we need just to meet normal decline curves, making the assumption that if China remains somewhat afloat and then India is increasing at the percentages they're increasing, that's kind of where I came up with that ballparkish number. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it's a fine number. Look, an $80 oil in today's dollars is not $80 oil 20 years ago. The deflationary power of the technology companies, but this fiscal break-even price, which you're referencing, is also a bit of a sort of bullish canard. We view Saudi Arabia as a giant ExxonMobil. Saudi
Right.
Aramco is an extremely well-run company, and they too will scoop up distressed assets at the low. They're happy to run at $50 for years. They're a good credit. People are going to lend them money. They're not too concerned. It's the countries like Venezuela and so on that'll suffer. But by the way, that might be part of the plan. I mean,
Yeah.
It sure seems that way.
The U.S. again, we wrote a piece. All we write about is energy, basically. The occasional China chip piece that nobody reads, but we wrote a piece called "Misreading the Room." We were talking about how Maduro wasn't getting what was going on, and there's going to be regime change in Venezuela. Look, when we talk about peak oil, let's just talk about this. Venezuela is Canada, except it only produces 1 million barrels a day instead of 5. I mean, so, okay, where's the next increment of 4 million barrels a day going to come from? Argentina Vaca Muerta is a resource that could be the Permian. The only thing that's missing is stable government and a critical mass of service providers, engineering firms, pipelines, and so on. If the price was right, we'd be we'd take the team that's assembled in Guyana and move it down to Argentina. Off the west coast of Africa sits a similar pre-salt formation that sits off the coast of Brazil. We haven't even looked across Africa but if you just take the top 4 oil producers in Africa and look at their, take the statistical review of world energy, we have so interfered with that continent and with Libya and Clinton and Benghazi and the Gaddafi being overturned, and we just ruined country after country after country, and we wonder why their oil production isn't high. I mean, we know where to go. I have plenty of contacts in the industry like you guys, and I have a friend who's an executive at a very happy executive at a company you would know, so I won't name him, but Jimmy, when we need to find it, we know where to look, right? It's just the concept of peak oil is such nonsense. It's
really
amazing to me, and we're just so good at getting it.
Yeah.
Like some of the best parts of the Gulf of America are just off limits. We just decided politically, hey, you can't drill there. Of course, we'll drill there at $150 oil.
Eventually,
right.
yes.
Yes, of course. And so it's managed, and that's probably prudent. But if you just look at the demand for oil, look, I mean, we will produce 120 million barrels a day of oil before the demand for oil, quote unquote, rolls over. But actually, what I think is going to happen, and what we've written about that's going to happen, and what you're going to see the Saudi Arabias and the rest of the remnants of OPEC do, including Russia, is they're going to switch to natural gas. The break-even price on natural gas production is such that lower energy prices still produce good profit. And these people are in the drilling business, so they'll just drill for gas instead. And the people in the pipeline business will just build gas pipelines instead of oil pipelines. And the cars will run off gas instead of by the way, you cook in your house with natural gas and don't even worry about ventilation. You wouldn't bring your barbecue inside. Right? So natural gas is clean. It has lots of advantages. Yes, it's a gas. Yes, it's hard to handle. Is that worth $50 a barrel energy equivalent? No. That arbitrage will close. The world is trending lighter. We're going to go from heavy crude to light crude to condensates to NGLs to natural gas. That is the arc of hydrocarbon trajectory. And if you think you can model the price of crude by just looking at crude inventories, you are missing what the market is telling you.
Wow. That's cool. I interviewed Nick DeLulius over at CNX, and he is a cool cat. I love our exploration and
He's a great guy.
I love them. They're just like Chris Wright and the other ones. We've got some great entrepreneurs out there. And he was saying that the Marcellus is so prevalent with natural gas that CNG you would be able to drill and put a CNG machine right there to go ahead and get the compressed natural gas into cars. Why don't we go that way?
Gasoline stations are a durable moat, and there's plenty of gasoline. And then instead of doing that, you could just molecularly transform lights into gasoline. I mean, refiners know how to do this. Chemists are talented.
Right.
If the Germans can make jet fuel out of coal, we can make gasoline out of natural gas if we had to. We don't have to today, but Pearl GTL exists, right?
Right.
And we wrote a piece a couple of years ago, a follow-up to our Peak Cheap Oil is a Myth piece, which triggered so much hate from certain skeptics of our work.
Your comments are
we all get that.
That the fact that GTL, gas to liquids technology, exists is Fischer-Tropsch. It's an iron catalyst. I mean, I think we know what we're doing. That break-even price of that facility is rumored to be about $50 or $60 a barrel. Well, that puts a ceiling on the equilibrium price of oil, because if it stretches too far above that for too long, we'll just build those GTL plants because they'll be incredibly profitable. Hydrocarbons are burned to create heat to do work. And the long arc of the industry is starting heavy coal, getting lighter crude, and now getting lighter and lighter still. And the very definition of oil is undergoing a semantic shift. Our view is oil needs to be defined as any hydrocarbon that finds its way to a refinery, and a fractionator is a refinery.
Huh. I like that.
That's why NGLs count.
They definitely do count. Yeah. You touched on this a minute ago, and I just want to have you expand on it a little bit because I think it's something everyone needs to understand. At $50 oil in the Permian Basin and these other oil-heavy shale basins, $50 oil means the big companies are going to come gobble up the smaller companies, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is exactly what ExxonMobil and Chevron and Oxy have been tooling their businesses to take advantage of in those basins. And so, I mean, yeah, we've had a lot of consolidation already, but do you really expect another wave of consolidation?
This is forever thus, David. I
Yeah.
mean, this is how
Yeah.
the industry operates. You've been around it long enough to know. You have all kinds of independents who get over their skis and have leveraged balance sheets, but are sitting on
Yeah.
great assets that might not be great for the next 18 months, and they're hated because oil is $40 a barrel, and they can't give it away, except the people who have been running Exxon know how to run Exxon and have managed through many cycles, and they just pile up the cash and wait, and they're not afraid to lose a couple of bucks a share each quarter, and they still pay their dividends because they know that you don't draw tangent lines to sine waves.
Right.
And so they know when they make all their money, and they know when to wait and buy all their resources to make all their money in the future. By the way, Trump's not going to give nothing to the oil industry. We're going to get long-term leases on federal land. They're going to term out the refilling of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in a way that you could hedge your production and have a good baseline. Chris Wright knows how the energy industry works. But the big majors are going to win. And by the way, if you ever go to an oil and gas conference, all you hear from the independents and the small players is how much they hate the big players. They don't hate the government; they hate the big players.
Right.
Right.
And the pipeline companies.
Right. And the midstreamers who are running an oligopoly, and everybody's dipping their beak, wetting their beak in my vig. It's the same story, right? And so. I guess that was
a great analogy, actually.
A bit of a pun, considering that I choose to identify as a green chicken. But yeah. And by the way, this is a perfect curve. Put that curve back up.
Okay.
This curve is actually irrelevant.
Oh, this is
Because what's the break-even cost of the combined production of natural gas and oil that you get?
Exactly. I was thinking of that while because I use this all the time because, everybody's saying it's, and so as we're doing this now, it needs to be updated this is from the Dallas Fed, and I love the survey. So the question that the Dallas Fed needs to ask now, if I'm following our conversation, if I'm in the same podcast, needs to be updated.
Yeah, well, look, so the classic example of co-product economics in the chemical industry is the POSM process, propylene oxide, styrene monomer. You make both. And if the price of propylene oxide skyrockets, you just dump your styrene monomer onto the market. Well, all the styrene only producers don't like that, right? And they lose money. Well, you don't care because you're making all bank on your propylene oxide. It's the exact same thing with natural gas and oil. And so what's happening in the Permian? There's a tiering system of the quality of the wells, right? Or the
right.
And right now, low gas to oil ratio wells are considered premium because you can't give away the gas in the Permian, and you want to produce more oil. Well, that just means that we've been distilling all of these high GOR wells, waiting to be, completed. And if the price of natural gas goes to $4 in the Permian, the break-even price of oil is irrelevant. In fact,
wow,
natural gas went negative in the Permian for most of last year. What's the break-even price for natural gas in the Permian? There is none because nobody wants it, right? But we have a good friend, Sir JJ, writes the Market Vibes newsletter, traded oil for 50 years. He has a great quote, which is pretty profound when you think about it. Oil is worthless until it gets to a refinery.
Right.
And
pretty
so
much, yeah.
Oil can be worthless if everyone wants your natural gas. And by the way, maybe you start seeing these off-grid AI pods that we've been writing about, where natural gas goes in one side of the building and data comes out the other. It's not connected to the grid. And at $5 a million BTU for 10 years, the data center operators and the hyperscalers might want to take that. Well, at $5 a million BTU natural gas in the Permian, the break-even price of oil could be negative, especially with the high GOR wells. But the fact that this is still utilized and published and surveyed tells you just how disconnected the market has become from the underlying tectonic shifts that are occurring, which is what we try to keep our subscribers ahead on.
Right.
Because if you're only analyzing the break-even price of oil in the Permian, you're missing the story. It's hydrocarbons. These are fungible. In the long run, all hydrocarbons will sell the same price, corrected for logistics and energy content.
Wow.
And major deviations are tradable opportunities. And you might say, wow, we have no crude inventory in the US. Why is oil so inexpensive? Well, because crude oil is just one input into the price of crude oil. It just is. The diesel in China is cheap because LNG trucks are coming onto the market.
Right.
When diesel in China is cheap, diesel in the rest of the world is cheap because diesel is a globally traded commodity. So the rain levels in Sichuan province impact the price of coal in Appalachia. Why? Because in China, hydro power and coal power are fungible. The government in dry years amps up its coal, and in wet years, it dampens down its coal. Well, if it rains a lot in Sichuan province, coal is a globally traded commodity. It's a solid. You put it on a boat. It's no big deal. If it rains a lot in China, you don't want to be long coal. Once you understand that energy is fungible, and the market is getting more and more efficient. So with each new LNG import and export terminal installed, and with each new pipeline built, that arbitrage closes. You can't have substantial differences. Stuff that do the same thing can't trade for different prices indefinitely. This is arbitrage 101. And right now, I'm waiting for the latest statistical review of world energy to come out in June, which is Christmas Day here in the coop. Yeah. But in 2023, which is the last year that we had data for it, 14% of global natural gas found its way to an LNG carrier. Well, you're getting to the point where that's a lot of intra-market penetration that stabilizes price.
That's a higher percentage than I would have expected, actually.
The war in Ukraine has accelerated that.
Yeah,
of course. Look at the U.S., right? I mean, the U.S. is trying to double its LNG export capacity by the early 2030s. I mean, look, 10 BCF per day of natural gas is a huge amount of gas.
Yep.
Right? And once you have enough floating inventory, regional price discrepancies are going to get closed, right? And the world will be left with a far more efficient energy infrastructure, and that is, frankly, bearish for the price of crude oil. So the long-term arc of the real cost of energy is down. Thinking we're running out of oil or that oil will be sustainably expensive is a giant short bet on human ingenuity. Now, luckily for the majors, their cost to produce is down too because they invest in technology and they perform acts indistinguishable from magic on a daily basis. So this is why you can make money at $2.50 a million BTU in the Marcellus shale, when for years before they started to produce there were many advocates who said there would never be economic natural gas produced in the shale patch. And here we are drowning in the stuff. Like you literally can't give it away, right? And so in the long run, this is what will happen. And the deviations in supply-demand mismatch that drive price spikes, and by the way, the occasional super spike in energy is the seduction that draws bulls into the energy sector. And our view is very, very simple. Far better to fade price spikes than to try to guess their timing. So war breaks out in the Middle East, oil goes to 125, great. Wait till oil drops to 100 and then buy $50 puts, because you're going to make a lot of money in about 12 months. Right?
Yep.
Far better to fade these spikes. We have a great Nassim Taleb quote that we've used to open a piece and worked it into a pro talk. Something to the effect of, I've never seen gluts followed by shortages, but I've always seen shortages followed by gluts. Like whenever you have a shortage of a highly inelastic commodity, what happens is price spikes and everybody runs to produce more, and you get a glut 6 to 9 months later. And so that price spike, you can make a lot of money if you get lucky, but it's like hitting it at the casino. You know, you got to know when to walk out.
Yeah.
This whole conversation is phenomenal. And again, thank you for your time today, because my head's exploding with how cool this really is here. This is a cool conversation. But I got a question for you here on President Trump. It was saying that he wants to turn LNG, and Chris Wright announced that LNG will be our #1 export product very soon.
Yeah.
I have been talking about I think we've got a weakness. We have one LNG flag tanker that's about $1.95. It's about as big as this hat. I mean, it's not very big at all. And I just noticed yesterday that President Trump was talking about buying tankers. Apollo snaps up LNG tanker platform from Norway, and they just so happens 10 tankers in that order from that. I'm like, President Trump does what he says he's going to do. I mean, it's just an amazing kind of a politician, even though he's not a politician.
Yeah, look, the value, the dollar value I saw as I was preparing this piece we're publishing hopefully Friday or Saturday, the dollar value of LNG exports was already the 5th highest among U.S. exports in 2024.
Yep.
And so the path from 5 to 1 is not necessarily all that crazy to project, and especially since we're probably going to double our LNG export capacity.
Yeah.
And U.S. flagged LNG carriers is interesting, and if the president wants it, I can understand why the Apollos of the world are trying to front run that trade. Not necessarily all that important in our view. Because once the gas gets on the global markets, who cares where it goes or how it's treated? But it does speak to a broader issue of U.S. shipbuilding capacity and Trump's desire to reindustrialize. And the real issue is we just don't build those ships, not that we don't own them. And so that's a whole.
We got to get around the Jones Act somehow.
There's also the Jones Act so that we could ship LNG to California, and we could ship LNG to Boston, which is crazy, but it is what
Insane.
it is. And now, to be fair, California does not have an LNG import terminal, whereas Boston does. But
No.
Even if California did, they couldn't get it from the Gulf Coast. They'd have to take it from Canada, which is, again, a whole other ball of wax. But we think Alberta's energy is going to get unstuck.
We'll have to do a show about Canada sometime.
Yeah, we had a good run on our Canadian predictions, I must say. Yeah.
But what about the super majors? I mean, California, the super democratic rule of Hawaii is really pathetic when you consider that 75% of their electricity is done by fuel oil, which is about the worst that they can possibly have. And they can't even import because they don't have an LNG import facility yet. Pathetic.
Yeah. Well, again, there was a time during the peak of the European energy crisis where natural gas in California traded for a crazy high number, and it was negative in the Permian. And I think it was $55 a million BTU in California and minus $1.50 in the Permian spot prices. That's just tells you where the problem is, right? I mean, the problem is politics. The problem is pipeline politics. And so that's why this, to circle back to Gavin Newsom in California and the inevitable refinery crisis that will transpire in California. Like, this is all just, it's not like building and operating refineries in a way that steadily, incredibly produces supply and dampens price spikes is a mystery. Like, people know how to do it. They've just chosen not to. And so, you have to, as Putin famously said about European natural gas buyers, you have made your bed, now lie in it. That's what we're going to have to see.
So,
Wow.
President Trump, I got one question I just got to ask you here before we wind this up. President Trump keeps saying, and it has been saying since at least December, that he wants $50 oil because he believes $50 oil is an incentive for Putin to negotiate a peaceful end to the Ukraine war. And I have to admit that I'm not clear on why that would be such an incentive for Putin to do that, but I wonder if you have a view on it.
So we were advocating for such a policy all the way back in 2022 when the sanctions war was rolled out, and we correctly predicted that not only would they fail, they would backfire.
Oh, yes.
And the piece, I believe, was called Crazy Pills. I have a slightly photogenic memory for the pieces we've written.
That's a great title. Yeah.
Because I felt like I was taking crazy pills. Watching this clown on 60 Minutes talk about how they were going to destroy the Russian economy by driving the price of oil higher because we're going to limit Russia's supply to the international markets. Okay, got it.
Right.
So if we had done it then, if the U.S. had done it then, and driven like what happened in the first Gulf War? James Baker went around the world and crashed some skulls. And he said, listen, fellas, we're going to turn the spigots on. We're going to flood the market with oil. Then we're going to go into Baghdad and do what we need to do. And you're going to do it. You're going to pump oil. You're going to lose money, and you're going to like it. And everybody did. And it worked.
Everybody did, yes.
Right? The whole Kuwait thing got snowed up. The Saudis participated in stabilizing the market. If Joe Biden had assembled the CEOs of all the major American oil and gas companies during the outbreak of the war in 2022 and said, we need $20 oil. And I'm going to help you offset your losses. You're going to get long-term leases to federal lands. We'll give you some assets. If your balance sheet's a little sketchy, we'll guarantee some loans. We're going to temporarily drive the price of oil to $20 a barrel instead of $125 a barrel. The Russian budgetary situation would not have been such that they could have rebuilt their military industrial complex to the extent that they have. It might be a little late now for that. I mean, better late than never.
Right.
But if the U.S. had done it in 2022, it would have had a significantly
I totally agree with that.
a higher effect. 3 years later, with a bigger military producing 3 times as many weapons as all of NATO combined, and deep partnership with China, things are different. Should have did that in 2022. Directionally, it is a correct statement, but I read somewhere where oil exports are now just 14% of Russia's budget, as opposed to much higher before.
Yeah, it was like 22%
Sure,
before, right?
Right. So the time to have turned the screws was 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And we did the opposite. The U.S. did the opposite. I keep saying we. I get scolded by the
The
editor
US
of
and NATO,
Doomberg.
yes.
We is I have to keep remember saying that to myself. The U.S. could have done this in 2022. Should have
Says
done
the man who identifies as a green chicken.
right. But like $120 oil was a gift to Putin. Printing cash at that level, and that cash was then recycled into its military-industrial complex to great effect. So it is what it is. You can only point out such problems in real time, and that Trump sees it now. I just worry that Trump sometimes boasts about having far more leverage than he actually does in reality, and this might be one of those circumstances.
I've done a series with George McMillan on the war, and his President Trump staff does not have the current information that they need in order to end the Ukraine war, because President Putin had a 4.2% GDP growth in his GDP through his energy exports and everything else. Germany's had 2 years of GDP decline, and sanctions have not hurt President Putin. There's 1,400 ballpark ghost ships. Of those, I think 200 or 300 of them are propane and other molecules. And so they figured out a way to get around those. I think Russia's ballpark 500 tankers or so.
Yeah.
I think that the right way to get Putin to end the war would be to do business with him as opposed to trying to beat him up.
Look, wars should be avoided because sometimes you lose them.
Yeah.
And
they're bad.
It's a hard lesson to learn, isn't it?
And losing wars is really hard.
Yeah.
And NATO has lost the war against Russia. I think there's a lot of denial, even amongst probably the people listening to this, that the war is lost. The war is lost. Russia stared down the totality of NATO support in Ukraine. The New York Times reports U.S. generals were directing campaigns and giving targeting information and so on. Like it was a war between the U.S. and Russia, and the U.S. has lost that war. Losing wars is hard, and how NATO loses this war is dangerous, risky.
Yeah.
Just even now, as Trump has tried in vain to end the war, while Trump may not fully have the facts on hand to understand the lack of leverage that he has, the Europeans are just delusional.
Oh,
Like they're
my God,
they're dictating surrender terms to Russia.
Yeah.
As a pull out of Ukraine, the 4 regions completely, and then we'll set up war trial, like war crimes against Putin, and like might is right. Unfortunately, there was diplomatic off ramps to this war, all the way back to 2015. Again in 2022, they were ignored or cast aside, and then if you're going to embark on a full-fledged war,
ordered to be not done,
sure, then you should expect that the outcome will be imposed militarily. And I suspect that that's where we're heading. There's a lot of danger in that. Like, we're still talking about nuclear powers.
Yeah.
And huge, false flag risk. And just to put it on people's radars, Victory Day celebration on May 9th. Xi Jinping is in Moscow, and Lula's in Moscow, and other world leaders are in Moscow. And Ukraine has threatened to target that parade. And if they do, it could very quickly escalate to a nuclear situation. And some of the more bombastic parts of the Putin regime have been implying as much on Twitter. Medvedev said that if Kiev attacks the Victory Day parade on May 9th, then Kiev itself might not exist on May 10th. And there's only so many ways that a city the size of Kiev would no longer exist. And so let's pray that that doesn't happen. By the way, if you're Ukraine and the leadership of Ukraine, you're very angry. You're right to be angry. You and your countrymen have suffered more than any other participant in this war by a wide margin. And suddenly Trump shows up and says, oh, let's make a deal. Well, so you can understand what's going on. You could even be empathetic to what's going on, but that doesn't make it less dangerous. And I think the Starmers of the world and the Macrons of the world and the van der Leyens of the world and the Merchants of the world live in a wholly different reality than the facts on the ground. And it's almost scary to observe. And it's a real warning to not get into wars. Like the next piece we're publishing is on the potential for a war with Iran. Let's hope it doesn't happen.
Oh, no, I hope not. No.
We'll see very mixed signals coming out of the Trump administration. If war breaks out in Iran, it will be the end of the Trump administration. It will, it will torpedo his presidency. So let's hope that Sainer
just be another Middle East quagmire.
Correct.
No,
when was the last war that we won the peace of?
Right.
No,
I can't think
there
of
would be an absolute disdainable stain of his presidency, and I don't think it'll happen. I think Pakistan fighting India is going to curtail that a little bit. It's causing it. That one's heating up pretty bad.
That's a whole other can of worms, isn't it? Yeah. The last war that we won the peace of was Grenada, by the way. That's the answer to the truth.
Yeah.
Let me share this one thing of Zero Edge. Tyler Durham asked President Trump a fantastic question. I'd love your opinion on this one. Let me just share this one clip. I love the fact that President Trump has opened it up to podcast hosts.
For letting us in here. I'm with Zero Hedge in the last administration.
Oh, yeah.
And us on social media, so we're really grateful to be in the White House. And this is not exactly sports related, but I've been dying to ask you this question for a long time, which is that 2.5 years ago, the Nord Stream pipeline blew up. Yeah. And despite what people like John Brennan and all the hawks said, you were one person who said Russia probably did not blow up its own pipeline.
Yeah, if you can believe, they said Russia blew it up, yeah.
And so I'm wondering now, you're president, if you would consider launching a formal investigation into what happened there and who actually did blow it up.
Well, probably if I asked certain people, I'd be able to tell you without having to waste a lot of money on an investigation. But I think a lot of people know who blew it up. But I was the one that blew it up originally because I wouldn't let it be built. And when Biden got in, he allowed it to be built.
I thought that was absolutely a hoot. Shout out to Zero Edge and Tyler, but holy smokes.
Yeah, it's a real whodunit, Stu. I mean, I really,
It's so hard to imagine.
it's really difficult to understand who might have had the means and the motive and the opportunity. You know, I think after having studied it carefully, it was the cast of Gilligan's Island.
There you go.
Or the Ukrainian SEALs. That was absolutely a hoot.
Oh, it was a 3-hour pleasure cruise, Stu, and they just decided
On a
on their
yacht.
own, with no help from any intelligence agencies whatsoever, to go on a bit of a scuba dive and blow up a decabillion-dollar piece of energy infrastructure. All kidding aside, I think everybody knows who blew up that
Right.
pipe.
But let me ask this. Energy as a export service, when President said, hey, what about managing the Russian nuclear plants in Ukraine as a service? Secretary Wright went, I'll do that. But then there's been the rumblings of President Trump stepping in and managing the natural gas out of Russia in order to help get the business, because the trading bloc for Russia has moved to India, South Korea, and all the other areas. They're building the railroads to help get more trade into the Asian market for Russia. I don't like that idea. I think we don't need to be in the middle of the European Union and Russia, in my opinion, but just wanted your opinion.
Neither of those things is ever going to happen. So no,
Good.
the U.S. is not going to manage a nuclear power plant in a disputed part of the Donbass, and no, the U.S. is not going to take over the midstream role of operating the remaining Nord Stream pipeline. The Europeans are so far afield on Putin and Russia compared to where Trump is. I'm not saying whether they're right or wrong, so don't come at me in the comments. But they wouldn't even loosen banking sanctions against a Russian bank needed to get the Black Sea grain deal back in the works that the U.S. had agreed to. So yeah, that's our view there.
Cool. I loved your opinion. And then we have another great comment from this one right here from John. How would that 20 Saudi?
Yeah, we're not going to get to $20 a barrel, at least not sustainably. $20 a barrel is deep in the hurt locker. And again, don't forget, we're at a point where you have $3,300 an ounce gold. And the last time we had $20 oil, I think we had $300
right.
oil. So I think 50 is the equilibrium price. If we go too far from it, then it becomes interesting to potentially get long the players that can survive it. But we won't be at 20 for very long.
And this next one has to be the last question. We're way over time here.
Yeah, that's a 20-minute answer though.
We're occupying Doomberg's whole afternoon here.
That's all right.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can put the question back up. I'll address it quickly. I think Canada needs to unstick Alberta's energy. Canada's constitution is highly unsettled. Its borders are fragile. The relationship between the provinces and the provinces with Ottawa and the country with Britain is complex, filled with lots of history. Carney, as a globalist delight, is the one politician who can credibly make a deal with Alberta. So here's what we think is going to happen. Alberta will trigger a fake constitutional crisis. Mark Carney will cut a deal with Danielle Smith. The Quebec question will be settled as part of a grand solution. And Canada will leave the Trump era more unified and its constitution settled and its energy unstuck than it otherwise would have. And it's all because of the threat of Orange Man Bad, which is air cover for doing all of this. And so given Carney's past, he is probably the only politician who can credibly cut a deal with Alberta, and Alberta is playing its role. And and we think that protests against major infrastructure projects that unstick Alberta's energy will be surprisingly muted because the Canadian press will go along, and references to climate change itself will begin to fade from the Canadian lexicon as the new
what a blessing
as the new Canada emerges from the Trump era.
Wow.
God, that would just be a blessing for all mankind if that happened.
Look, that's a long shot prediction, and we did call Carney winning the election over the Conservatives when Carney wasn't even a contract that you could bet on Polymarket. So maybe we're running a parlay and pressing our luck, and we should just take our chips and exit the Canadian casino, having made a good call. But we got a piece to publish every 4 days, so why not go out on a few limbs?
Why not? It's my philosophy.
I like it.
All right.
I'd like to say thank you, Mr. Doomberg.
man,
I
thank you
really
so much.
appreciate you and your great leadership.
It's really great to be here. I enjoyed it. Yeah, the hour and 10 minutes flew by. So
It did. Always does with you.
cool.
All right.
All right. Thank
Well,
you. Thanks everybody
and,
for joining us.
You bet. Hey, we will see you guys again soon. And I'm ending it right here. Here we